Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
What is up, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Grady Duggan, and I hope you all are having a wonderful day so far. We have a lot of things to dive into this episode, so I don't want to waste too much of your time. We're going to be talking about the obvious COVID-19 pandemic and the possible fantasy football implications that it presents, as well as some guys who I think are set to have a bounce back year this year, and a few players who have shown some glimpses in the past and now have the potential to burst back on the scene and really become rising stars in this league. So, as we begin to dissect the coronavirus implications for the NFL, this is a pandemic that has been raging through just about every part of our country since early March. It's hard not to follow these updates closely and wonder what exactly the NFL is going to be doing to prepare for this season and keep their athletes safe in what will be by far their most complex season in a long, long time. If you look over at the NBA, who announced recently that they are going to be resuming their season in a bubble-like environment in Orlando, Florida on July 31st, 7 weeks before that date, they released a 13-page document of all the procedures of what the teams were going to be having to follow. And now we stand at about 5 weeks ahead of the NFL's July 28th training camp start date, and there has been little to no announcement on what exactly they are going to be doing. Aside from canceling the first preseason game, the Hall of Fame game in Canton, Ohio, you have heard very little from the NFL's front office. It's interesting because as this pandemic hit the United States in March, NBA was just gearing up for their playoffs, and the MLB was about 10 games into spring training and a month away from beginning their season. So with the NFL, it really looked like they had a huge advantage on this whole thing because of the amount of time they had to plan and really sit back and watch. But as cases begin to rise again in a lot of different states, it is starting to put a lot of things in question for all of these sports, especially the NFL. And this is a fantasy football podcast, so some of you might be thinking, how exactly is something like this going to affect my fantasy football teams? And there honestly is a handful of different ways that could go on. First off, you have players being given the right to opt out of this season. For example, Malcolm Jenkins of the New Orleans Saints voiced his concern on CNN, saying that football is a non-essential business and was wondering why they were going about it the way they are. However, he did quickly clarify on his Twitter after his interview that he does want to play this season, and most of the people he has talked to want to play. So it's going to be interesting to see if anyone really sits out, especially because this is these guys' livelihoods. This is how they put food on the table. This is how they take care of their family. So to sit out, though, there is the health risk that they do have to accept. Sitting out might not be an option for as many people as you would think. But you are going to be looking at situations where what happens if all of a sudden a team has an outbreak and 5 players of the Denver Broncos have to be out for 2 weeks. This is when fantasy football owners have to sit back, reach into the depth of their roster, and really know where to go from there, because there are going to be times where players are going to have to automatically go into quarantine and not be able to play for 2 weeks. And that is how the biggest way fantasy football owners are going to be affected by this pandemic, which will lead to some depth players being a really big deal in fantasy football this year. So if you stick around for later in the episode, I'm going to go over some rising stars, some guys who showed glimpses and really have the potential to have huge seasons this year. And those are the guys you're going to want on your team, some under the radar guys who, if something goes wrong, you're going to have a dependable wide receiver or a dependable running back on your team. But that is something I'll get into later in this episode. And carrying over into another aspect that will not only help those rising stars that I was just talking about, but also you as a fantasy football owner, is the new NFL collective bargaining agreement has expanded the rosters for all NFL teams. So they are going to go from 46 active players on every single Sunday to 48. And teams are now being able to hold 12 practice squad players rather than 10. And there has been some discussions of that practice squad going to 16 this season because of everything going on. So that right there gives teams a lot more leeway to keep players on their roster and in their building as they move forward trying to navigate this season with the coronavirus, and which could have a big impact on fantasy football, just because these guys aren't going to be free agents or getting cut. You're going to be on a roster, and any given week, if people get sick, they could be the ones whose number gets called and have to perform on Sundays. So that is why some third string and maybe even fourth string running backs and receivers are going to have the opportunity to really provide for you in fantasy football this year. For example, the Seattle Seahawks have Chris Carson and Rashad Penny in their backfield, a two-headed monster. But if any of them go down, they also have a very reliable Carlos Hyde in their third string. So it's going to give opportunities for people like that to continue their success in the league and also come up big for some fantasy football owners. And somewhere where fantasy football owners live and die really is the waiver wire. If you are good on the waiver wire, you have a chance to be really good. And this year, that is amplified because you are going to have to be wheeling and dealing and making moves that are going to be able to benefit your team consistently down the road. And look, I know this isn't a fun conversation to have. I don't want to be having it. We all just want to be talking about football. But the reality is this coronavirus is something we're going to have to live with, and it's going to affect not only football, but our everyday lives. So you just have to face reality and discuss how this really could impact the football season coming up. You have to look at how they're going to manage certain outbreaks, how they're going to manage what to do with their players when that happens. I mean, you look around the country and there's college football programs like LSU, University of Houston, University of Texas, Clemson, who have all started to congregate and hold workouts, and they're all having outbreaks. And while it might be good to have it before the season, or at least to an extent where it's manageable, it's something that we have to have a procedure for, and that the NFL needs to have things set in stone and set in place on where they're going to be instructing their teams to put and act with those players. So I'm no expert, no doctor. I realize that I don't know the scientific aspects of this pandemic, but It is my job to prepare you guys for the fantasy football season, and I just want to have that conversation and help us prepare for the reality and different aspects that are going to be coming with this NFL season, which is really shaping out to be an interesting one, to say the least. I'm excited to get sports and football back, but there's definitely some different obstacles that are facing the NFL. So that's that. That is my coronavirus spiel. It's over. It's done. And now let's have the real fun start. If you stick around with me after the break, I am going to be taking a look at a handful of players who have had some success in this league, but didn't play too well last year and are poised to have a big bounce back season. So I'm excited. Stick around and we will get after it.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right. Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We have some exciting stuff to talk about coming up, and we're going to be looking at the top bounce back players of the 2020 NFL season. Some guys who you're used to hearing their names. They're usually big time contributors, and last year kind of fell off a little bit, whether it was injuries, quarterbacks, anything, just down in production. So these are some names that you will all have heard of that are poised to have a big comeback year. And the first person I want to start with is Indianapolis Colts receiver T.Y. Hilton. This is someone who throughout his career has consistently put up over 1,000 yards, was one of Andrew Luck's number one guys through his career, and I think that's one aspect that people don't take into consideration enough when looking at T.Y. Hilton's 2019 campaign. About 2 or 3 weeks before you have your starting quarterback and Andrew Luck retire, that's going to throw the locker room into a little bit of a swirl and confusion before you kick off a season. And not only did Andrew Luck retiring hurt T.Y. Hilton's production, he also was hit a little bit with calf and quad injuries. And as a receiver, those are tough injuries to come back from when you're depending on running with your legs most of the time. And especially if you don't have time to get back to full strength against NFL corners, that can make it tough. So 2019 was the slowest amount of receiving yards. He had just over 500, and his rookie year he had 800, and other than that he had put up 1,000 yards in every season. So now with the Indianapolis Colts getting a lot of weapons, with Jonathan Taylor at running back now out of Wisconsin, they have Phillip Rivers now at quarterback, and really behind one of the best offensive lines led by Quentin Nelson, I am expecting T.Y. Hilton to hop back in the driver's seat of that receiver core and really get back to where he has been for the far majority of his career in Indianapolis. The next guy I want to talk about is really an interesting case, to be honest. Hayden Hurst, tight end, who is now on the Atlanta Falcons. He was a first-round pick back in 2018 for the Baltimore Ravens and had high hopes coming into the league, has potential and athleticism to be a very good move tight end, which is what offenses are now starting to kind of switch to. And the Falcons are an offense that really rely on their tight end. Matt Ryan likes to get the ball to his tight ends. And with Austin Hooper signing with the Cleveland Browns in free agency this year, Hayden Hurst really has an opportunity to go into Atlanta and be that number one tight end in an offense that loves to get the ball to the tight ends. And while Hurst might not have put up huge numbers in Baltimore early on in his career, you have to take into consideration that the year after drafting him, the Ravens went ahead and drafted Mark Andrews out of Oklahoma, who has really blossomed into one of the top tight ends in the league. So Hayden Hurst didn't exactly get a fair shake of opportunities with his time in Baltimore. And now he goes over to Atlanta, who traded a good amount of draft stock to get this tight end after they lost out on Austin Hooper in free agency, who signed with the Cleveland Browns. So Hayden Hurst really is going over to a new team, an offense who likes to spread the ball around to their tight end and has a great opportunity to flourish in an offense that loves to spread their ball to the tight ends and really be that number one guy behind Julio Jones. And the tight end position has really just become more and more valuable in recent years. But let's get back to the receiver spot. A guy who I think is going to get right back to where he was in his first 2 years is Juju Smith-Schuster, the USC product, who is now a Pittsburgh Steeler. He burst on the scene with a big rookie and sophomore year, but then last year, due to a lot of different aspects, struggled to get going in Pittsburgh. The whole offense kind of struggled. When Big Ben got hurt at quarterback, they really went with Mason Rudolph and Devin Hodges, who both had no NFL experience, and it showed, to say the least. He did not have a reliable quarterback, and on top of that, James Conner was in and out of injuries, and it was really easy for defenses to just key in on Juju Smith as just about the only threat. But I think that offense is going to bounce back as a whole, and Juju Smith-Schuster has a very good chance to get back to his wide receiver one numbers in fantasy football, especially in that offense and in a PPR league. He is going to be putting up big numbers. He is a reception monster, and he also has the ability to stretch the field and take it to the end zone just about any time he touches the ball. And him and Ben Roethlisberger have a great history and great chemistry. So I would expect that even with Ben Roethlisberger getting up there in age, a 38-year-old coming off an elbow injury, no matter how you cut it, that is worrisome, but it is also 10 times better than any of the quarterbacks he had last year in Mason Rudolph and Devin Hodges. So no matter how you cut it, I think Juju Smith-Schuster will get back to his ways and get back to putting up really wide receiver one numbers, like I said earlier, for fantasy football. And that is a guy who you'd have to get in the first probably 3 or 4 rounds, I would think. But that's a pick that will pay off quick with the amount of points that Juju Smith-Schuster will probably get back to putting up. Now we're going to get over to the quarterback position for the first time today. And I want to discuss someone who is kind of a wild card in the fantasy football world just because of where his career has been the past 2 to 3 seasons. And that guy is Teddy Bridgewater, now the starting quarterback of the Carolina Panthers. Bridgewater had a gruesome leg injury in 2017 when he was still with the Vikings before signing with the New Orleans Saints and being Drew Brees' backup for the past 2 years, where when Brees went down with an injury, Bridgewater came in and showed his capability to still be a very productive starter and someone who could lead a team to a lot of wins, to be honest. And that is exactly what I think he is going to do in Carolina under new head coach Matt Rule from Baylor. This is a coach who is bringing another spread kind of air raid college offense to the NFL the thing is he has the weapons around him to really succeed. Aside from the obvious Christian McCaffrey as one of the most dynamic running backs in the league, Teddy Bridgewater has a receiving core of Robbie Anderson, Curtis Samuel, and DJ Moore. While those might be some players who haven't put up huge numbers, those are all players who pose a big threat vertically, and that is exactly what Matt Rule's offense is going to be looking to do. So I think that the Carolina Panthers as a whole and Teddy Bridgewater leading that offense have a chance to really bounce back and have a good offensive season. Teddy Bridgewater, I think, could be a top 12 to top 10 fantasy quarterback this season, and honestly, someone who you could probably draft in the later rounds simply because he hasn't had a full season as a starter in a while, and people are almost going to kind of forget about him in drafts and try and get the bigger names who have been there for a longer amount of time. But I would expect Teddy Bridgewater to have a very successful year. I do want to talk a little bit about why a bounce back player like these guys I'm talking about is so important, because you guys might be sitting there saying, we know about T.Y. Hilton, we know about Teddy Bridgewater. These guys aren't some big secret. And I realize these aren't some secretive guys. These are guys who have had careers in the NFL. They've shown success. The thing is, though, in the first 3 rounds, anyone can draft the Saquon Barkleys or Larry Fitzgerald or Lamar Jackson. But to really win a fantasy football league and to have success, you're going to need to hit in those rounds 5 to 9 or 5 to 10, because the front 3 guys you draft, yeah, they can carry a team a little bit, but to really consistently beat teams every single week, you're going to need these guys who might not have had such a great year last year, or might not be so high up on draft boards to really push your team forward and over the hump. And so that's why guys like Teddy Bridgewater and T.Y. Hilton and Hayden Hurst can be a huge benefit to your team. And there's a couple more guys that I am going to talk about. And another bounce back guy who got injured last year, was really having an MVP season before he got injured, is Matthew Stafford. I know that's not the flashy pick that people want to hear, Detroit Lions. The thing is Darren Bevell's offense is a balanced offense. They're going to be running the ball with DeAndre Swift and Kerryon Johnson, but their passing game is their strong point. Matthew Stafford is still a top 6, top 7, I think, fantasy football quarterback. He's got Kenny Galladay, Marvin Jones, Danny Amendola, TJ Hawkinson. So he's got the tools around him to really succeed. And I think if he stays healthy, which last year was kind of a crazy situation, he hadn't been injured for like 5 years, 6 years, if not more than that. So I wouldn't really take his injury concerns seriously, because Matthew Stafford is a durable quarterback. He plays through a lot of pain, and I'm expecting him to be a top 6, top 7 quarterback, like I just said. I know the Detroit Lions can be hard to trust, but they play in a competitive division, which means they're going to be in competitive games, if not losing sometimes, and that can lead to needing to pass late in games or through the fourth quarter. And it's just another reason why Matthew Stafford could be a valuable piece to your fantasy football team. Another guy I want to touch on, the first running back I have talked about today, is someone who not too long ago, this guy was really referred to as a top 5 player in this league. David Johnson, the one-time Arizona Cardinal running back, now with the Houston Texans. And I mean, in 2016 or 2017, I think it was 2016. He rushed for 1,200 yards, 16 touchdowns, and also was a threat out of the backfield in the passing game. He really was someone who was one of the most dynamic running backs in the league, and he kind of got lost when the Arizona Cardinals hired Cliff Kingsbury and they switched to a spread-like offense and kind of just overhauled the whole franchise. And now he goes over to Houston, where Deshaun Watson desperately needs some help on offense. They traded DeAndre Hopkins, so a lot is going to go into David Johnson being successful there. They're a big play action and pound the ball team. So I think David Johnson has a good opportunity to really maybe not get back to where he was 3 years ago, but be a consistent provider for that Houston Texans team, because I don't think there's much in front of him, and he's going to be the guy who Deshaun Watson is going to look for to be that big-time contributor with that offense. They have Duke Johnson as well in the backfield, but I still think David Johnson will outcarry him by a big number and be that bell cow of a running back that he used to be. So expect him to maybe not get to where he was, but be a reliable, maybe flex position or second running back or someone you can put in when your running back's on a bye. Just a good kind of breakout guy to have in your back pocket on your fantasy football roster. Another guy you really wouldn't have to go too far for another bounce back candidate is Brandon Cooks, new receiver for the Houston Texans. First year over there, he signed after being with the Rams the past 2 years. Last year was his first season having less than 1,000 yards since his rookie year in 2014. The Rams just couldn't really get anything going. Now he gets to go over to Houston and be another tool for Deshaun Watson after they let go or traded DeAndre Hopkins over there. So I could see Brandon Cooks being another candidate to have a big bounce back year in that offense. I know a lot of people have kind of harped on that offense ever since DeAndre Hopkins was traded, kind of wondering in a way what the heck Bill O'Brien is doing over there, trading their good players. But, you know, with Brandon Cooks, David Johnson, they do have Will Fuller if he can remain healthy. That is not a terrible plethora of weapons for Deshaun Watson to be getting the ball to. So you know their quarterback's going to be able to do it. Expect David Johnson and Brandon Cooks to both be solid contributors. The two final names for this list for the top bounce back players of the years are two guys I am very high on this season. They did not show out last year, but I think they are about to have a very good season. Another team duo, and they are two of, honestly, the biggest names in the league in Cleveland Brown quarterback Baker Mayfield and receiver Odell Beckham Jr. These are no secret that they did not exactly have their best stuff last year. And you might say, what are you talking about, Grady? Odell still had over 1,000 yards. And yeah, he still had over 1,000 yards with 133 targets, but he only had 74 receptions, which is low for him. And then aside from his 2017 campaign, where he only played in 4 games, last year was his by far lowest fantasy outing of his NFL career. And with Baker Mayfield really had a big rookie season in the back half once he came on and started for the Browns and really looked like he could be one of the next elite NFL quarterbacks. And then he came into the 2019 season and really regressed, if I would say so myself. He did not look good, really staggered at a lot of times. He was a big-time interception machine. He turned the ball over and really kind of lost that swagger that you're so used to seeing Baker Mayfield play with. But while they might have had bad years last year, I think there is a lot of optimism for that Cleveland Browns offense and Baker Mayfield and Odell Beckham Jr., to be exact. To be honest, Odell Beckham Jr., it's no secret. He is one of, if not the most talented receivers in the NFL, if not of this generation. And he's shown that time and time again. And I think he is going to bounce back and really be the number one guy for that offense, especially when they have Jarvis Landry. They now have Austin Hooper, David Njoku. He's not going to be targeted by defenses like he was in New York. They have other weapons to form around him and be an extremely good offense. And with Baker Mayfield, when you look at what he did his rookie year, he showed that he can be a very formidable quarterback in the NFL. And now that the limelight's kind of off of him a little bit, he doesn't have as much pressure. You know, you got Big Ben, you have Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson in that division. He's honestly kind of the least appealing storyline in that entire division. So it takes the pressure off him a little bit. And I think he's going to come back with a vengeance and have a big year for the Cleveland Browns. One stat that I found particularly interesting when it comes to this Cleveland Brown offense with Baker Mayfield, Dan Orlovsky of ESPN tweeted out earlier this week that in his first 2 seasons, Baker Mayfield has thrown
35 interceptions. And let's just be upfront right there. That is bad. That is not good. But 29 of those interceptions have come on drop back plays, non-play action pass. Baker Mayfield is his best when he is a play action quarterback. When he is moving around after running, that's how he excelled in the Oklahoma offense in college. And Kevin Stefanski, the new head coach coming over from the Minnesota Vikings, their offense, Kevin Stefanski's offense in Minnesota, was 40% play action. That is going to benefit Baker Mayfield a huge amount, and the turnovers will likely go down to a great extent. So I would expect Baker Mayfield and Odell Beckham Jr. and the entire Cleveland offense to really come back and be one of the top 10 offenses in this league. They have the firepower to do it. So I would watch them because they could greatly help your fantasy football team. So that just about does it for my bounce back players. I gave you a lot of good names. I gave you Odell. We got Juju Smith-Schuster, Baker Mayfield, Matthew Stafford's another one, David Johnson and Brandon Cooks, of course, from the Houston Texans, and Hayden Hurst. Two other guys that I won't go as deep into, but that I thought about talking about was Le'Veon Bell and Adam Thielen. They did not have as good of years last year. I think Le'Veon Bell will be a little bit more comfortable in the Jets offense, and Adam Thielen now doesn't have to deal with the distractions of Stephon Diggs and everything. He can just be the number one guy in that offense with Kirk Cousins. So those are another two big names to watch out for. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and stick around after the break. We're going to look at what rising stars to pay attention to as we go into the 2020 NFL season.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right. I am glad to have you guys back here as we get ready for the second half of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast today. We just went over some bounce back players heading into the NFL season. We're just about a month away from training camps kicking off. I gave you names like Baker Mayfield, Hayden Hurst, David Johnson, just to name a few. And we got another little topic to go on for some names. We're going to be looking at the rising stars in this league. Some younger guys, not necessarily rookies, but maybe 2 to 4 years in the league. Some have shown glimpses and then haven't really. Some had a big rookie year and are poised to just continue to be a rising star on this league. Not so much names like Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes. You know, those guys, yes, they're young. Yes, they're rising stars technically, but let's be honest, they're already stars. They're already two of the best players in the NFL in just a short amount of time. We're going to be looking for guys who haven't gotten that star power yet, but really have a lot of room to grow in this league and are just starting to scratch the surface of where they can be. First guy I'm going to be taking a look at is
third-year running back out of Georgia for the New England Patriots in Sony Michel. This is a guy who has had high hopes both years he's been in the league and honestly has delivered. He's rushed for over 900 yards in each of his 2 seasons in the NFL. Hasn't quite hit the 1,000-yard mark, but in his first season, he only played 13 games, so you could imagine if he played a full season that rookie year, he was most likely going to get over that 1,000-yard mark. And now that they don't have Tom Brady at quarterback, they're going with second year man, first year as a full-time starter, Jarrett Stidham from Auburn. There's going to be some need to take the pressure off a young, fresh quarterback for Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniels, and I think Sony Michel is going to be looked at as that top guy in the offense. I mean, they have Mohamed Sanu and N'Keal Harry, who has high hopes. I mean, if he had delivered in his rookie year, N'Keal Harry is another guy who could be on this list, but he didn't really have that good of a rookie year. He was injured a little bit, stayed quiet, so that could be a big component of their offense. But I think Sony Michel, he knows how to hit his holes. He's quick. He can catch out of the backfield. He had big numbers out of the backfield in both years, so I would expect him to do really well. They like to find him out of the backfield and passing downs in the red zone as well. So expect him to have pretty good numbers coming into his third year and be really the key component of that New England Patriots offense. Up next, another young guy whose name is no secret, just like some of the guys we've been talking about. This is your 2019 Rookie of the Year, Kyler Murray, also former number 1 pick out of Oklahoma for the Arizona Cardinals. And he just has a lot of potential and a lot of great things around him to succeed. Cliff Kingsbury, coming over from Texas Tech, is now his coach. He brought over a really spread air raid offense, which is the same exact offense Kyler Murray has been running for 3 or 4 years, and it showed in his rookie year what he could do in that offense. He threw for just under 4,000 yards with 20 touchdowns, and then don't forget about what he can do on the ground as well. I mean, he's got a huge rushing threat with his feet, one of the fastest quarterbacks in the NFL. He rushed for, I think it was 544 yards last year, which is a lot for a quarterback. And I expect that to continue on, especially now. I mean, he's got Kenyon Drake, a substantial running back, and then he's got DeAndre Hopkins, Larry Fitzgerald, and Christian Kirk as his wide receiver core, which is arguably one of the better wide receiver cores in the league. So he's just got everything around him to continue to succeed. And I think he has the opportunity to really make a jump in this NFC West. He plays in a tough division, but the Arizona Cardinals are improving. They are a dangerous team, and I think Kyler Murray really has the potential to be another Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson-like quarterback with just all the tools they have. He's not just a one-stop or one-shot pony. He has everything in store that he can bring you. So Kyler Murray is a name to really watch out for a long time in the NFL. Now, this next guy I'm going to talk about, maybe should have started with him just because he is the least accomplished on this list, but I think someone who could have a big comeback year this year is Trent Taylor of the San Francisco 49ers. He did not play at all in 2019, but in 2018, 2017, he was a solid slot receiver for the Niners. 2017 really was when Jimmy Garoppolo got traded, and he came over and started the last 5 games of the season, and Trent Taylor was by far his favorite connection. And then in 2018, with the ACL injury to Garoppolo, the whole Niners offense was crippled with C.J. Beathard and Nick Mullins starting, so they didn't get too much production out of anyone. But in 2019, going into the season, every report out of the 49ers camp was that Trent Taylor was the best player on that team. He was really performing in training camp and his preseason until he had a Jones fracture in his foot, which is usually a 4 to 6 week recovery, but then he ended up getting an infection. The surgery went wrong and he ended up going out the whole entire year. But this is a receiver who they're going to need to step up. Deebo Samuel and Richie James are both hurt for the 49ers, and Trent Taylor has shown that Jimmy Garoppolo has trust in him, and when he's on the field, when he's healthy, he is one of the better slot receivers in this league. He just hasn't gotten too many opportunities to show it yet because of injury. So that's a name to keep an eye out for, kind of a rising star, or could put himself into the conversation of being a rising star. It might take him a couple weeks to get on a fantasy football radar. I get that, but that is just another name to look out for. Now coming up next is two teammates that I'm big on. I don't know exactly how the team's going to do in total or as a whole, but Drew Lock and Phillip Lindsay of the Denver Broncos. Phillip Lindsay had a great rookie year as well as a great year in his second year last year. And then Drew Lock, the quarterback who started at the end of the year last year, really gave the Broncos a little glimmer of hope for the first time really since Peyton Manning was there. Just showed that he is going to be that franchise guy. He has the potential. He's got a big arm. He plays with a lot of passion, and it's just one of those guys that people get behind and want to play with. And now Phillip Lindsay not only has been one of the, if not the best running back on that team the past 2 years, he's rushed for over 1,000 yards. He's a great threat out of the backfield. So if you're in a PPR league, that's a big get. He had 35 receptions each in 2018 and 2019. So that right there shows you his value on top of his rushing value that he brings to the table. And then Drew Lock, let's just get into his stats last year. Rookie year out of Missouri. He only started the last 5 games of the season because of a thumb injury, and they just wanted to give him a little time to develop, get used to the NFL. I think the Broncos knew they weren't going to be contending last year, so they said, no reason to rush our rookie quarterback into the ring of fire of the NFL. But last year he started 5 games, threw for over 1,000 yards, 7 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, with an overall quarterback rating of 89.7. So his capability is there. He's got an extremely strong arm. He needs to fix his accuracy a little bit, but as you can see with the only 3 interceptions, it's not like the accuracy is leading to interceptions. So now he's got another year of experience under his belt, and they say the second year is when players really are supposed to take that big step in development. And so I expect Drew Lock to be one of the top 15 really fantasy football quarterbacks next year. They have a good receiving core with Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy out of Alabama. So the talent is there around Drew Lock with Phillip Lindsay. So expect those two to really continue making a name for themselves in this league. And Phillip Lindsay is one of the better kind of under the radar fantasy football guys you can have in a draft, as well as Drew Lock. You could probably pick him up in the later rounds since he doesn't have as much experience under the belt. You could even do him as a second quarterback if you wanted to play it safe. And he could produce for you week in and week out. As I was doing my homework for this list, Nick Bosa is another name that continued to come up. However, I'm not going to talk about him too much as a defensive player, but if your league does have some fun and let you have one defensive player, that is a good guy to have. I mean, he 9 sacks in his rookie year in San Francisco. He really transformed that defense and made it what it was. Without him, that defense was still a dang good defense, but he really helped that defensive line and front 7 take it to a whole nother level. So Nick Bosa is just a fun little defensive guy to throw out there. But we're getting back on the offensive side. This is a fantasy football podcast, so can't harp too much on the defensive side. But if you look at Las Vegas Raider, almost said Oakland there. It's going to be weird getting used to that one. But Las Vegas Raider, Josh Jacobs, running back out of Alabama, he showed what he can do. This guy is impressive to watch run. He ran for 1,150 yards in his rookie year behind what is probably not that good of an offensive line. It has improved, but in John Gruden's offense is a complete grinded out, we're going to shove this football down your throat and just run the ball as much as we can. Josh Jacobs is only going to continue to put up bigger numbers. And that was only in 13 games. He hurt his shoulder at the end of the year and didn't play the last 3 games. And honestly, you could probably make the argument that if he plays the rest of that season, I think personally was probably going to be the rookie of the year over Kyler Murray. but those games hurt him in production and numbers, obviously. So he didn't end up winning the Rookie of the Year, but going forward into the 2020 NFL season, looking at it for fantasy-wise, he's going to be a guy late first round, early second. You're going to have to get him off the board, but Mike Mayock, general manager of the Raiders, has said that he thinks and wants Josh Jacobs to be more involved in the pass game, so that's another added aspect to his fantasy football game. And he really has a high-end running back 2, if not running back 1 upside in the fantasy football world, and his production is not going to go anywhere. So Josh Jacobs has the potential to be a big-time star in this league, especially in John Gruden's offense, which emphasizes and relies on the run so much. And they got Henry Ruggs this year out of Alabama too, so they're only getting more weapons around him and taking the pressure off of Josh Jacobs. So expect his fantasy football numbers to continue to pop off, and really has the potential to be one of the top 5 to 10 performers for fantasy football wise and numbers. So you really can't go wrong with him. He's going to be a star in this league. Staying on the West Coast, we've been really between the AFC and NFC West. We're going to stick with the NFC West. This player, DK Metcalf, second year for the Seattle Seahawks. He had 900 yards receiving in all 16 games last year. So this is another receiver who really has one of the top quarterbacks in the league, who spreads the ball out to just about everyone on that field. And I expect DK to continue his growth as a wide receiver. One of the knocks of him coming out was that he can just really run a straight line out of Ole Miss, really just avert a vertical threat, but he showed that that is not the case. He did a great job for the Seahawks, so expect him to continue to grow and grow. One thing with rising stars is, yes, they're young, they have a lot of potential, but it takes them a couple years in this league. It's a hard league to have continued success in, so a lot of times they got to get their feet under them. They experience the speed of the NFL, kind of what's going on around them, how to be a professional and not a student athlete. Just there's a whole big learning curve when you go into the NFL that a lot of these guys, they're starting to get the hang of it. And once they get into year 2, year 3, it can be a big leap and they can really start taking off in their career. And I expect these guys to do exactly that. I mean, you got some potential here for the next generation of NFL stars, and all of these guys can really help consistently in your fantasy football leagues if you want to get to the top and win, which, I mean, you ever in a fantasy football league to lose? I don't think so. So those are my guys. There's a couple other ones we could touch on. I mean, Marquise Brown of the Baltimore Ravens obviously had a huge year for Lamar Jackson and Baltimore. Mark Andrews is another guy in that offense, big rising stars in that team. I mean, just the whole team in general has a lot of young, what do they call it? Building blocks. A lot of young building blocks to be successful for a long time. Good coach in John Harbaugh. So those are some guys I would expect to continue that development. You have the guy in the wide receiver in Washington too, had a big year last year. What's his name? I'm blanking on it. Terry McLaurin out of Ohio State. That's it. I knew I would get it at some point. He had a big year for the Redskins. And it's really interesting to see all these young guys come into the league. It's a different league than it was 5-6 years ago. They've went heavy pass, which really does affect fantasy football in a huge way. But not only has this league went to a more so pass league, they have kind of changed up the concepts in the running game too. They also are a very young league. You know, evaluators are looking for youth. They don't want as many veterans. Not as many veterans, that's not the way to put it, but they want guys to be younger, less tread on their tires, unless you are a proven veteran. So that's why these rising stars can be big for your fantasy football teams, because the teams, when they're looking at players and who to pick, they want people who can potentially stay there for the next 4 to 6 years. They don't want a guy who, this will just be my starting receiver for the next year or two, unless you're a contending team like the 49ers or the Chiefs, where they're really trying to get that Super Bowl window in. But for the most part, this is a league that values youth, values being able to have someone for the foreseeable future. And that really brings an interesting aspect into this Rising Stars league or list for the league. So it's one thing to take into consideration when you are drafting your fantasy football team is what, especially if you're in a keeper league, what guys are going to be on a productive offense for a long time. And it's these rising stars who are really just starting to show glimpses of what they can be in this league. And I just hardly scratched the surface on Rising Stars. I gave you DK Metcalf, Trent Taylor, Josh Jacobs, Drew Lock, Sony Michel, Phillip Lindsay, among others. I mean, there's so many young guys who have potential to really be in this league for a long time. So just because those are the guys I listed does not mean there is a lot more out there. There totally is. This is a talented league full of young, youthful players that have bright futures ahead of them. So thank you for listening to that segment. I hope I helped you guys a little bit with your fantasy football drafts. Next, after the break, stick around. I'm going to be giving you a little sneak peek of what my strategy is in a fantasy football draft. I'm going to be really going in depth about that next week, but I'm going to give you a little sneak peek, kind of show you what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm excited to do it. So stick around and we'll be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered. Listen, it's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back, everybody. I am glad that you all made it to the last part of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm excited to have you this far. We just went over a lot of good stuff in this episode. It's a jam-packed episode where we went over the COVID-19 implications and what is going to go on or what could go on in football this year because of the global pandemic that is going on in the world right now. We went over some players who are poised to have a bounce back season as we enter the 2020 NFL year, and as well as some rising stars, some young players who have had some success in this season and are looking to really cement themselves as big time players in this league. So I hope you enjoy what we have talked about thus far in this episode. And as we are getting ready to wrap up, I am going to give you a little sneak peek of what I'm going to be going in depth about next week. And that is the strategy of what to do as you go into your fantasy football draft. So over the last little while, I have given you a lot of names to look out for as you prepare for your 2020 NFL fantasy football draft. Who to pick up, what sleepers are there, what bounce back players are there. I've given you a lot of names in the NFL. But now I'm going to briefly discuss kind of what to do and what to look for in your fantasy football draft, because as much success as you want in your fantasy league, it all starts with the draft, and you have to kind of be able to maneuver your fantasy draft. The draft can be an interesting thing to go into with a lot of different strategies. You can be thinking of where you're going to draft certain people, where are they valued, as well as what positions are valued at certain spots. A lot of people like to pick up their quarterbacks early. A lot of people like to pick up their quarterbacks late. I am personally of the belief that unless you have an early draft pick in today's world where you can get a Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson, I'm the type of person who wants to pick up their quarterbacks late in the draft, which is something I'll get into more next episode. I'm just not a big quarterback early guy. Even when those people are available, you can get a lot of value for different positions early on in the draft and then pick up a quarterback at least later on in the draft and still have a successful team. So one of my main strategies of fantasy football that I want to go in depth about next week is the matter of waiting a little while for quarterbacks, because you can get a value pick in, let's say, the 6th or 7th round after you've kind of filled out a lot of your roster. So that is one of my big strategies. Another thing I try and use to my advantage is I like to go through position by position with running backs, tight ends, and receivers and kind of rank them in tiers. So I'll put 3 or 4 receivers as a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type thing. And then I'll do the same with running backs and tight ends and different positions. And I kind of try and value those tiers at certain rounds. So I know if I'm in a certain round, these are the tiers that I want to at least be targeting. Even if it's not exactly the right spot, at least you know you are going into the draft with a goal of getting some sort of value at certain spots in the draft, which is big because you don't want to be reaching, or you don't want to be drafting a value player. Let's say you want someone in the 3rd round and all of a sudden you're drafting them in the 2nd or 1st. You got to be careful on where you're drafting people, because that can have a trickle-down effect on the rest of your draft. Another thing we can talk about in the next week's episode is if you look at what position is more valuable, receiver, running back, where are you going to fill up your roster first? And obviously a big thing depends on who is on the board. That is one thing that doesn't get talked enough about when strategizing for your fantasy football draft. A big thing is who exactly is going to be there, because without knowing who is going to be on the board, you can't really have a big know of what is going on. You have to realize that certain people are going to be off the board at certain times, and you have to be ready to prepare for that so that you can put a good draft board together. The tight end position is another position when putting a draft board together I really like to kind of key in on, because those guys can really be the red zone threats that you need, that weekly, consistently are getting those touchdown looks. And that's something in your fantasy football team that you really can't overlook, is getting those red zone looks. So tight end is another position I will dive into deeper. It's one of those things that how many tight ends you want to carry kind of varies with every single person. But one thing I have seen that has really helped me in past years that I can't stress enough or recommend enough is getting 1 to 2 tight ends. I mean, obviously 1 because you need 1 in your roster spot, but getting 2 tight ends that both are a big red zone threat. If you can have 1 tight end in the flex that gets a lot of red zone looks, that will really potentially put your team over the hump and get you into that next tier in your fantasy league. It's something that you really can't overlook and is worth kind of taking into consideration. I mean, obviously there's certain receivers or running backs that you can't go wrong with in the flex, but the tight end position holds such a red zone threat at times that it really can pay off into your benefit, and it's something to pay attention to. Another aspect that tight ends can help your fantasy football game is if you play in a points per reception league. If you're in a PPR league, that honestly changes your whole draft strategy going into drafts because certain players have such higher values. And personally, I don't like playing in non-PPR leagues. I think it's kind of boring in a way if you don't play in PPR. Makes it more exciting, makes a lot more people have value in your fantasy football drafts. If you're not playing in a PPR league, points per reception, it honestly, you become so touchdown dependent. And that makes it so much more difficult to me that it's just much more worthwhile to play in a PPR league. It makes a lot more running backs worthwhile, and it makes that flex position a lot easier to fill because you're so not kind of dependent on that flex position. Because if you are in a non-PPR league, that flex position becomes a crucial position to try and fill with someone who can get in the end zone week in and week out. And honestly, that can be difficult in fantasy football, especially once you get into the later rounds where you're looking at your flex position. So it's something that you need to kind of judge what league you want to be getting into, whether it's PPR or not PPR. That is a driving factor in the fantasy football strategy of a draft. Something that you really have to think about before entering a league. But, I mean, both have their perks. I'm not going to deny that. But I much, much more prefer a PPR league. It just gives a lot more dynamic to the league. But hey, I'm glad we could go over a little bit, just touching briefly on my fantasy football drafting strategy, whether it's PPR or not. You got your tight ends, your wide receivers, your running backs, what tiers certain people fall in, what rounds certain tiers are not designed to, because you can't design a tier to a round, but just kind of where you want to draft certain players. I'm going to get much more in depth about that. What players are where, what players do I think might be a little overvalued, things like that. But I had a great time today talking to you guys. I hope I gave you a little insight on what I'm feeling for the 2020 NFL season and the fantasy football teams. And, you know, I talked about how COVID could really drive this season and really affect the fantasy football world, whether it's a team getting fully infected or really nothing at all. You know, got to hope for the best, hope for that to be the stake or the instance, but you really never know with the world we are living in. So there's that. We talked about the bounce back players. I gave you some, you know, Odell Beckham Jr., Baker Mayfield, players like that who are poised to have a big bounce back year after not doing so well. We also looked over kind of some rising stars, some of the younger players who have had a lot of success in the league, or not a lot of success, have had glimpses of success and now are really poised to make that consistent touch of success. And really players like Josh Jacobs, DK Metcalf, Drew Lock, some younger guys who are looking to really cement themselves as key players in not only this league, but of course, fantasy football leagues. So I hope you guys had just as good a time as I did talking to you guys, learning the ins and outs of the fantasy football world, and I really appreciate you guys listening. So thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you have an extra minute, I would like to ask you that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review at the bottom. That really helps us out. We would greatly appreciate that at the GSMC Podcast Network. Also, if you have time, please go ahead and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We put up some great content on our social media platforms and could really help you build that fantasy football team. Thank you, and I hope you guys have a great night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.